Now, when I saw you guys last week, we were going over what took place at Midway. Now, you have to kind of keep something in mind. What happens at Midway is really going to be the D-Day of the Pacific. It's going to change the momentum the way things are going, because after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese were running through the Pacific unchecked. There was no one that could stop them because they did have so much success at Pearl Harbor. Now, as we talked about before, there was only one class of ship that's really escapes Pearl Harbor. What is it? The carriers. But the carriers are the future of naval warfare. Now, at Midway, the Japanese are kind of stunned about the success of the Doolittle raid. Now, we had kind of talked about that before, what a miracle that turned out to be. We're going to hit a handful of Japanese factories, but psychologically, it's very damaging for the Japanese. They thought they were invincible and untouchable. The Doolittle raid is going to change that. What this means is they want to do something to bring the American carriers out. The plan is actually very clever. Do you remember, what was phase one of the plan? What were they going after? Do you guys remember?
A decoy for Alaska.
Excellent. They're going to send this decoy convoy up to Alaska. It's clever. But what's their big problem that they don't know about? What's their problem?
We have broken.
Excellent. We know what the plan is. We're prepared for this. When Midway does come, we are very much going to catch them by surprise. At the end of this, do you happen to remember? They had how many carriers before Midway? Had 5. Now they lost 4.
We only have one left.
Thank you very much.
Wait, didn't we lose one?
The score is now going to be 3-1. Now, here's the deal.
No, we didn't lose one.
Well, we're talking major carriers here. Now, with that said, what we're going to do today, build upon that success. The success we're going to build upon is going to be what we have at Guadalcanal. Now, you just say it one more time with me. Say Guadalcanal. There we go. All right. Guadalcanal. No, it's Guadalcanal. Now, Guadalcanal is going to come in August of 42. Now, in order to kind of take a look at the importance of this, we got to take a look at the map. Guadalcanal is this tiny little island at the end of the Solomon Island chain. It's right in here. Now, it's one of literally thousands of little islands that dot the Pacific. But what makes Guadalcanal so important is actually going to be a theme that we've talked about before. Guadalcanal is just big enough to hold, what was it?
It's a strip.
An airfield, certainly. Guadalcanal could support an airfield. It's just big enough for that. Now, that's what makes it so important, because if the Japanese take Guadalcanal, they can create the airfield. They now have the capacity to run heavy bombers round the clock. Now, I want to ask, does it look like Guadalcanal is within range of Hawaii? Nope, can't get there. That's way too far. Who does it look like it's in range of?
Japan.
Australia and New Zealand. Now, we talked about this really at almost the very beginning of this. The Australians and the New Zealanders are our closest allies in the Pacific. In fact, we call them our England in the Pacific. Now, I'll go ahead and ask you, why do you think we call them our England of the Pacific?
Because they were originally England.
They were English colonies. So they're part of the English Commonwealth. They speak English. They actually have a very kind of similar history as to us. They were colonies of the British Empire. But Australia was a very different kind of colony than we were. It was a prison island.
Yeah.
They would send the worst offenders off to Australia. And even today, the Australians take this as, I guess the best way to explain it is like they almost like take pride in this, you know, kind of like a funny way. When I was younger, I knew 2 guys. One was Australian and one was a New Zealander, and they were like the perfect example of this, because they would they'd make fun of each other all the time, and all the time it came back to, oh really? Is that what your prisoner ancestors would say? And then someone got punched. That's how things ended with them all the time. The Australians and the New Zealanders are really friendly people. but they're also a little bit crazy. We need them in the Pacific because they're actually doing some of the most dangerous jobs in the Pacific. They would often volunteer for what's called the island watcher jobs. They would simply, like small groups of them, infiltrate these islands controlled by the Japanese and spy on them. Now, if the Japanese caught you, they had some very interesting ways to make certain you didn't do it again. I told you guys about the bamboo on the fingernails, right? Yeah, they had some other tricks that they really liked to do. What they really liked to do also is they would take like this bamboo rod and just put it like behind your neck and just tie your hands to it. So as you're trying to walk through the jungle, you can't really do it very well. And at the same time, if you fall behind, well, they just kill you. This is just another little trick that they do. This is what the Australians and the New Zealanders would volunteer for. They would be the island watchers, meaning that we need them. If they get knocked out of the war, we're in a whole lot of trouble. This airfield threatens the communication that we have between Australia and New Zealand. We got to keep them going. Now, I will tell you this little story, but I got to do it real fast. I want to just give you this little window into these two knuckleheads that I know, because like I said, they're like the perfect examples of an Australian and a New Zealander. These guys, I played rugby with these guys in college. These guys were always the ones who took things way too far. I bet you have a friend that you can think of right now who does that. I have a friend like that. These guys made a mockery of him. These two guys, we were in a tournament in California, and I remember this because I was roommates with these guys at this tournament, and we got our room the night before the tournament starts. We're on the third floor of this hotel, and right underneath us is the pool. I can see some of you already thinking what I was thinking. It's like, oh no, this is probably bad. Within, honestly, 5 minutes of getting in there, it was the New Zealander said to the Australian, I bet you won't jump off the balcony into the pool. Before he said pool, this guy's going over the edge. And I'm looking, going like, oh, there's going to be a body down there. So I see him fall and just go up to the edge and watch him splash into the pool. I'm like, oh, thank goodness. Like, he's only badly hurt. He's not dead. And he comes up to the top, and the first thing he says, he goes, your turn.
Oh, Jesus.
And I remember, again, like, the New Zealander's right next to me. Before turn comes out, he's just popping over the edge. Jumps down, and he's falling down, and I'm watching this happen going, he's going to hit the Aussie. I'm like, how do I explain this to the news? So he jumps down, he missed this guy by like a foot. He could not have been like any closer. And then he comes up to the surface, and they both just look at each other and just giggle. And I'm like, you guys are idiots. Like, we have to play tomorrow. Like, get in gear. So they come back upstairs going, I'm like, you guys are dummies. One of them, I wouldn't have believed it if I didn't see it, had a bottle and smashed it on his head. Please don't do that. But he did. The other one picked up a piece of glass, put it in his mouth, and started chewing it. And I'm like, stop!
Like the Grinch.
Just like the Grinch. That's exactly what I thought. No. He's like bleeding everywhere, and they're just giggling at each other. I'm like, we still have to play tomorrow. And they're like, your turn. I'm like, no, I'm not an idiot. Like, I don't want to do this. But this is a nice little window into these knuckleheads. Because like I said, they're very friendly, but they're a little bit crazy.
Still a little.
Those two idiots. The fact that the Japanese are building on Guadalcanal, or potentially could, is a big problem. We cannot have our England in the Pacific cut off. If they're cut off, we lose our biggest allies in the Pacific. We have to keep them going. So that means we better take the island. Now, we've kind of talked about a few different options here. You could try to bomb the island, it's possible, but we'd have to bring out one of the carriers. Don't want to do that. We need a way to take the island without really risking one of those carriers. So we need to put people on that island.
Yeah,
Send in the Marines.
Yes.
Some of the finest warriors in all the world. You need a job done, you send the Marines. An amphibious landing is always complicated. When the Marines land on Guadalcanal, they've been told, we're not exactly sure where the Japanese are, because this is a thick, dense Pacific Island jungle, basically. They could be anywhere. They could be in front of you, behind you, all around you. We don't know, but we need you to figure it out. Remember when we were first kind of talking about this, or I was talking about the citizen soldiers, how it was just, you need to figure this out because it's for the society. If you lose, we lose the society. So you better win. Send in the Marines. For weeks, they're going to be battling out in these really nasty kind of conditions. It's hot, it's humid, it's this thick, dense jungle where you don't know where the enemy is. It is a 360-degree battlefield all around you. But if you want a job done, you send the Marines. For weeks, they're going to battle it out in kind of really, not like a huge, massive pitched battle. It's small, it's individual, really throughout the entire island. We're going to hold that island, and now we make an airfield on Guadalcanal. Now we're starting to project power further in the Pacific. Now I do just kind of want to point this out. Taking Guadalcanal means now we have the heavy bombers here. Now I should ask, do you think that's a problem for Japan proper yet?
No.
No.
Not yet. You can't get that far. But what can you do?
We're going to the other islands and take them over.
Step by step,
Island hopping.
we're going to get closer to Japan. One island at a time. You got to take it one piece at a time on your way to Japan proper. We got to get close enough where we can then create an airfield where the heavy bombers can hit Japan. Now we're here. We still have a long way to go. One small piece at a time, we are going to island hop on our way to Japan. You gotta take one, then another, then another, then another. We're on our way to Japan, and keeping in mind the Achilles heel of the Japanese Empire. They don't have the natural resources to be an industrial giant. They've had to gobble them up. So every time we get a step closer,
They lose resources.
they lose resources. If you can knock out the resources, the empire will fall. Now, we're going to continuously do this for years, all on our way to Japan. When we finally get close enough, what we're going to see take place is something we've known before. But this is on a level that even shocked the people that had been fighting in the Pacific for years previous to this. Really, the last island we need to take in order to create an airfield and launch those heavy bombers is Iwo Jima. Now, Iwo Jima is right here. It's this tiny little rock in the Pacific. It's basically a big dormant volcano. But then the north end of the island is fairly flat. Same kind of pattern that we've seen. It could be used as an airfield. Now, something that makes Iwo Jima a little different from the other islands we've talked about is Iwo Jima is almost like a Japanese cousin island. It's not the home islands, those are different. But this is as close as they get. And even the Japanese kind of see Iwo Jima as their territory. But they're not the same as the Japanese people. They're a little bit different. Now again, I'll kind of just use this reference. They sort of have a hierarchy of race as well. If you live on Iwo Jima, you're a step below the Japanese home islands. Now with that said, they still see it as theirs. This tiny rock in the Pacific is really the last thing we need before we can hit Japan proper. We could use it as an airfield. So now we gotta go get it. If you want something done, send the Marines. When the plan to take Iwo Jima is put into place, you have these